Hi everyone, I'm Cyrielle Filias, the Program Learning and Development Specialist at CERIC. And on behalf of all the CERIC team, I would like to welcome you back to week 2 of our webinar series, Using Research for Evidence-Informed Career Development Practice. Today, Loline Burdol will discuss how to use existing research and what are the different strategies we can take when using existing research to inform our work. But before starting today, we got the chance to gather one more time to learn together. And I would like to take that as an opportunity to invite you to consider the indigenous connection, past and present, to the land from where you are learning today. I would like to acknowledge that for me and the CERIC teams, the Huron-Wendat, Petun, Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and Mississauga Anishinaabe of New Credit share a special relationship to the territory in which our office is located in Toronto. So we are very grateful to have the opportunity to learn together one more time on these lands today. Now, just a couple of housekeeping notes for today's webinar. So you can interact with Loline and ask your question or share your comment at any time by using the question section that you see on your screen. We'll have Q&A session at the end of today's webinar where we will address your question, and also Loline will use some reflective question for you to work on during today's webinar. You will also receive the recording of today's webinar along with a presentation slide within the next 24 hours. And finally, our presenter made available free resources that you can download from the handout section and that you can use throughout the webinar today. But with all that, let's not wait any longer for Loline to start her second presentation. So over to you, Loline.
Great, well, thank you. I'm just going to share my screen. So I'm assuming that you can see the slides. Cyril, could you just, or Norman, if you could just confirm that?
Yes, we can see that perfectly.
Perfect. Great. Well, I'm going to get started. So thank you everyone for being here, and for those of you who were able to attend last time and are returning, thank you for coming back. So as Cyril mentioned, we are going to be looking at using existing research in your career development practice. And so just to really situate us to where we are, where we were, and where we're going. So this is, of course, a three-part series. For the first recording or first session was last week, looking at some sort of foundational basics that would apply regardless to what area of work you're working in. Ideally, you'll have had a chance to either have attended last week or listened to the recording. If not, I invite you to return to that recording at some future time. Today, we're going to be looking at existing research, and we're going to be focusing on sort of the body of information that's already out there for you to make use of. And then next week, we're going to be talking about conducting new research. And so we're just going to divide it up in that way. So I just wanted to make sure everybody was aware of where we're at. So for today, by the end of this webinar, ideally you'll be able to do a few things, and I'm going to lead us through a process that should get you to these points. So you should be able to explain how knowledge of evidence and research relates to your work as a career development practitioner, identify strategies that you can use to locate research studies that are relevant to your own work. Explain the difference between peer-reviewed and non-peer-reviewed research. So we hear the language of peer review a fair bit. Get really clear on what that exactly means. Go through the core components of a research report, and then discuss how to read research reports critically using what my co-author Jason Roy and I refer to as a two-pass approach. And it's a way to engage with research that will actually save you time and allow you to be a bit more effective in using research. We're going to talk about cognitive biases and how they can influence how we engage with research and interpret research, and the things that we need to be able to do to try to challenge these biases and work with the fact that as humans we have these biases. We all do. And then finally, develop strategies to assess the trustworthiness of research. So as we go through, and this is the same as last week, I'm going to ask you to be engaged in a bit more of an active learning approach. So the handouts are available to you. I encourage you to download those if those are helpful. If not, just use pen and paper. But I encourage you to engage in active note taking. I know for myself, when I listen, and just listen, I sometimes don't take in as much as when I make notes as I'm going along. So I encourage you to take notes as we go along. I'm going to be providing some things for you to do as we go. I'm going to ask you to take some action steps and to respond to some reflection questions. And so I'm going to ask you to actually write those out. If you're willing to do so, I encourage you to share your responses in the question box. I'll try to give a bit more time than I left last week so that people can do both writing and share them. At the very end, I'm going to have some time for a self-assessment against those learning outcomes that I provided at the front end. So I'm going to encourage you to write those down as well. And then as we go, and also possibly at the end, please feel free to put your questions into the question box that's available to you, so that I can make sure that the content that we're talking about today is directly relevant to the work that you do. So with that, I just want to catch us up sort of previously on in terms of what we covered last week. Just to remind you, when we're talking about evidence, we're talking about data or information that provides a basis for a position, a basis for an argument, a basis for a point of view, and these might be facts that have been recorded, or they might be based on observations. And research is one source of these types of observations. And the reason that we want to consider evidence in decision making, and that might be decision making in terms of our practice choices, that might be decision making in terms of policy decisions, or decision making in terms of what we're going to stop doing or start doing, or how we're going to tweak things. The reason we want to consider evidence is that people make decisions for reasons. Evidence can be a type of reason to support a conclusion, and so we have evidence-informed decision making, evidence-informed practice, and so evidence can be one of the reasons that people use in decision making. And so if we are engaged in evidence-informed decision making, or evidence-informed or evidence-based practice, we want to make sure that we're using good quality evidence. And so that's what we're talking about today. Now, we're seeing a move more and more in a variety of disciplines towards evidence-informed practice or evidence-based practice. So I wrote recently in CareerWise, many career development practitioners strive to make decisions based on evidence. This is a good thing. Evidence-informed approaches can help CDPs adjust client practices to achieve superior outcomes, increase credibility in efforts to influence policy, and assist in obtaining or maintaining funding. And so there's a number of benefits that I'm sure you can see to your own work in engaging with research, engaging with evidence, and having evidence-informed practice and decisions. The challenge is sort of how do we do this? So last week, I asked everybody in a reflection question, does your organization use evidence to inform decision making? And if so, how does it obtain this evidence? A number of you put your responses into the question box, and thank you very much for those of you who did. I've got just some selections of responses that people put, just in case others are curious. So someone wrote, we use labor market information for government websites. Another reported that they collect evidence directly. Another person reported labor market information, and then they use it to help clients make an informed decision. Use paper evaluations, looking back at numbers of previous outcomes, client surveys, data collected from pre-program start through to post-program completion, looking at what other institutions are doing. And these are just some examples of what your colleagues have said they are doing in terms of using evidence in their practice. And so we see a variety of different responses of how people are using evidence. I think it's in some ways useful to sort of think of evidence as being in three different boxes, in three different ways that people can engage with research and evidence. And I've got these deliberately color coded as the colors of a traffic light to sort of suggest the amount of ease and ability in terms of using this. The first, and this is where we're going to focus today, is using published research. And this is really accessible to everybody. The great things about this is that it's got a lot of efficiency involved in it. You don't have to spend the time doing research. You don't have to spend time analyzing other sources of data. It's just available to you, and it's very inexpensive. Often it's free. And so really all that's needed in terms of engaging with published research is the ability to locate studies, which we're going to talk about today, the ability to read critically, which we're going to talk about a bit today, and also the need to use information responsibly, which we're also going to talk on. And I encourage people as well to make sure that that you're familiar with questions of, well, how do we interpret research? How do we appropriately cite and source research and so on? And there's a lot of resources out there for people. The next two, the yellow and the red, are things that we're going to touch on next week. So secondary data analysis is when somebody uses data that have been collected by others, but they do their own analysis of it. So what this means is that there's some efficiency and some cost savings because someone else has done the work of collecting and designing the study and collecting the data. Someone else has paid the expense of that. And quite often there's minimal charge or no charge to use it, depending on how accessible the data are. What's needed there is the ability to locate studies, to analyze and interpret data, and to use information responsibly and situate the studies. Finally, the final column, and we'll touch on this again next week, is primary data collection analysis. So this is the deep end of the pool, and this is where people are doing their own research. They're doing their own data collection from start to finish, and so there's a lot of things that are involved here: time, funding, expertise in terms of design, the ability to engage ethically with data collection, data analysis, data storage. There's a lot of things involved in that, data interpretation, responsible use of data and information, and situating research in the larger published literature. So the reason I'm spending an entire session on this green box and moving the other two boxes to next week, and really wanting to focus a lot on this green box, is I think there's a lot of sense that people have in terms of engaging with research that they have to do a lot more than they might need to do. There's a lot of information out there, and there's a lot of ways to engage with research that can be in this using of published research already. Sometimes things might be easier than you might expect, and so I really want to focus on some easy ways that you can make use of work that's already out there for you. So in terms of engaging with research, you need to be able to, of course, locate this research. Where is it, and how do you make sense of it, and how do you make sure you can use it to inform your work? And what I'd like you to think about is that you want to make sure that you're using research and locating research that's credible. We'll talk about that. That's accessible to you. So it's, I can tell you it's, and I'm sure some of you have had this experience as well. It's very frustrating to know there's this study out there, and then it's like you can't find it Like you know from searches that it exists, but you can't access it, or you might be able to access it, but it's not written in a language that you're able to read, and so on. So, you know, accessibility is an issue as well. And then it also needs to be relevant to the work that you're doing. And so we need to think about those three. If you're someone who likes an acronym, we can think of that as CAR. But we want to find research that is credible, accessible, and relevant. So we're going to start with credible, because if something's accessible and relevant and it's not credible, you of course don't want to be using it. You'll recall from last week's webinar that I introduced you to the idea of the evidence continuum, and at the far end of the continuum was misleading evidence. And so this is evidence that has problems with it, serious problems with it. And because of these problems, you don't want to be making use of it. And so we want to make sure that we're starting with credible evidence. We want to be making sure that we know how to sort out what is credible and what is not credible evidence to be making use of. There's sort of a number of different things that I want to call to your attention. The first is the distinction between the academic literature and what's referred to as the gray literature. So the academic literature is literature that is typically produced and research done by people working in academia, professors, graduate students, postdoctoral fellows, research associates within an academic setting. These are often in the form of academic books and academic journals, and they might be restricted access, something that's behind a paywall, or a book that you have to purchase. They might be open access. So these are open access, are things that are available to anybody online. So it might be one or the other. Typically, if they're journal articles, and sometimes even books, these are available through university library databases. So if you have access to a university library, some people have a university affiliation of some sort, or they might even have some people through their alumni programs are able to continue to access university libraries. These university library databases are ways to find this academic literature. And this academic literature is typically peer-reviewed, or what's referred to as refereed, peer-refereed materials. And I'll discuss what peer-reviewed means in just a moment, but this is the academic literature. Literature that's not academic is typically referred to as gray literature. I'm not sure why it's called gray, but that's what it's referred to as. The gray literature can include a number of things. It can include newspaper and magazine articles. It might include government reports, think tank reports, NGO reports. It might include professional journals. So, you know, often there's practice journals, and it's typically not peer reviewed. Now, there's a lot of, just to be really clear, there's a lot of excellent gray literature out there. And so the fact that something's gray literature doesn't mean that you don't want to use it, but it's important to be aware of what's academic literature and what's gray literature, and it gives you sort of different things that you're going to think through when you think through screening what's credible and what's not credible. So what's peer reviewed? Peer-reviewed work is work that has gone through where researchers have submitted it, and their peers, other researchers, other academics have gone through a process of vetting that research. And so peer-reviewed research, I've got here, it's work that's clearly gone through a blind peer review process. Blind peer review, I should be really clear. A blind peer review means that the researcher does not know who is assessing their work, reviewing their work, and the reviewers don't know the names of the researchers who have done the work. And so the idea there is it's to reduce or eliminate bias in the peer review process. Peer review should be clearly listed on a journal's or a publisher's webpage. And so, for example, the University of Toronto Press is a publisher in Canada, and they will note, this was a peer-reviewed academic scholarly book, and it'll be very clear of their processes, and so you should be able to access them. So one of the publishers writes on their site the explanation of why peer review is important. So Wiley writes, peer review is designed to assess the validity, quality, and often originality of articles for publication. Its ultimate purpose is to maintain the integrity of science by filtering out invalid or poor quality articles. Peer review functions as a filter for content. Running articles through the process of peer review adds value to them. So as an academic researcher, I publish in peer-reviewed venues myself. And in terms of my progression through academic ranks, in terms of my assessment of my work as a professor, I report on the peer-reviewed work that I'm done, and I am assessed in my job in terms of my peer review work. My work, when I send it out for peer review, my colleagues, I don't know who they are, they don't know that it's me that has submitted the article, review my work, and I get feedback on the articles that will say, this needs to be fixed, or this part's good and this part's not clear, and it ultimately improves the quality of the work. Also, as an academic, I get articles to peer review, and I don't know who they're from. The reviewers don't know it was me providing the review. And I say, well, this is good about this article, and this is not good about this article. And we provide this this quality control. It's part of the academic research process. A real challenge that has come up in I'd say the last decade, and it's becoming more and more of an issue, is what's referred to as predatory journals. And this is something that that is a problem for not just academics, but it's a problem for people who are outside academia trying to access peer-reviewed work, and it's a problem for academics as well, because people outside academia are trying to access peer-reviewed work. They don't understand that these predatory journals exist, and there can be a lot of confusion, and then that diminishes the legitimacy of academia. So this is a real issue that we're seeing. What a predatory journal is, just to quote from Nature, they write, predatory journals are a global threat. They accept articles for publication along with authors' fees without performing promised quality checks for issues such as plagiarism or ethical approval. Naive researchers are not the only victims. Naive readers are not the only victims. Many researchers have been duped into submitting to predatory journals in which their work can be overlooked. I would add to that, not only their work can be overlooked, but it actually diminishes that researcher's own credibility. So as an academic, I get literally every week probably 5 to 10 solicitations to publish in these fake journals, and my spam filter's getting better and better at picking them up. But this is a real issue for academia. It's a real issue for those of you outside academia who are trying to access peer-reviewed work, because it's like, well, what is real and what isn't, and this is a real problem. I'll just give an example from 2014, and I apologize for the foul language, but this was an example of how bad this is. There's these fake conferences that exist as well, and they're just trying to gouge money, and they're incredibly disreputable. So some computer scientists made this fake paper with a 7-word phrase that you can, get me off your effing mailing list. And it just repeated that again and again for 10 pages, but it put in some, here's an example of the flow chart, but put in some fake graphs using the exact words. And they would just send this in to try to give a bit of a pushback against these unwanted solicitations that we continue to get as academics. And then one academic decided to send it into a journal as a joke, and he actually got this paper accepted by this predatory journal, and then asked for money. So this sort of shows you how much of a problem and how completely disreputable these predatory journals are. The point of this is to really hopefully reinforce for all of you that it's important as consumers of of existing research, as users of research, to do due diligence. Just like you don't, if somebody tries to get you to, I don't know if you get this all the time. I always get the, hey, can you contact me immediately? I'm in a meeting, send me a gift card. You don't do that. We're too smart for that, hopefully. We need to be the same in terms of really being careful and saying, what is legitimate peer-reviewed work? And so there's something called Beall's list. There's the URL there. So this is a list, and they keep updating it, of different predatory journals that you can often sort of go to a number of different sources and say, okay, is this a good journal, or is this not? And I'll talk about some specific journals for your field in a little bit. But just do the due diligence, and don't assume that just because some website says it's peer reviewed that it is. You can look at journal rankings. You can look at there's a number of steps you can take, and the more you start to do it, the more you can start to say, oh yeah, this is a really highly reputable journal, and this one I've never heard of, and I'm a little suspicious. It seems a little wonky. Be cautious on this. If you're using the gray literature, you want to be careful and consider the source. Statistics Canada, good source. Gray literature, but great source. Is it some organization that you've never heard of, that it's really kind of unclear, versus an organization that was established in 1971 and has this sort of long track record and everybody knows about it? You want to be really careful and thinking those things through. The last thing I want to note is if you have access to librarians are amazing. I'm always saying to my faculty and to my graduate students and to my students, and I say to you, this, librarians have this wealth of knowledge and can be incredibly helpful. And so if you have access to librarians through local university libraries or through universities you're associated with, connect with them. If you have access to city librarians, municipal librarians, they might be willing to be helpful as well. In my experience, every time I've asked a librarian, hey, can you help me with this? They've been absolutely incredible. So please keep that potential source in mind. A couple hints as well in terms of accessible research. So open access means it's available to you online. And a lot of very reputable peer-reviewed articles are available to you online. Some of them are behind paywalls, and it can really vary. So a number of ways to if you hit a paywall, you'll know it because you'll be like, oh, this article looks great. You click on it, and then it says, okay, please pay $35. You're like, $35 for one article? And that's my reaction as well. If you have access to a library, a university library, if you log in through the library site, quite often you can get it directly in that way. Another way to get it is to check the author's website. Quite often, what is allowed is the article that the author is allowed to put a link to the article on their own website. It might be in a slightly different form, like it hasn't been laid out or things, but quite often that's allowed. There's a site called ResearchGate where you can access articles. Google Scholar, sometimes people can access articles in that way. The other thing, and I'm always surprised the extent to which people are reluctant to do this, it doesn't, and it's typically not a problem, is academic articles, they'll typically list a corresponding author. So maybe there's 5 authors, but there's a footnote that says, the corresponding author in this case is Lolian Birdall, and here's her email address. You can actually just email the corresponding author and say, hi, I'm really interested in your research. I'm a practitioner. I think it might be relevant to my practice. I don't have access to a library database. Would you be willing to send me a copy? Quite often people will do that, and so I encourage you to make use of that. In terms of finding relevant studies, so I've discussed credible, I've discussed accessible. So the last thing here is relevant. I think you want to look at a number of different sources. So there's a great piece that is available on CareerWise, talking about 14 academic journals that highlight career development research. So I encourage you to just take a look at that. So if you just Google that exact title, Lindsay Purchase wrote that, and there's a list of 14 academic journals that are completely relevant to the work you're doing. Some of them are specific to individual countries, but there's a wealth of information there. As I mentioned, library databases are things that you can do. Looking at Statistics Canada and government agencies, especially for things like labor market information, demographics are great sources there. There's a number of organizations that you might consider: CERIC, Future Skills Center, the Canadian Career Development Foundation, Google Scholar, as I mentioned, and then you can do searches within that, and you can click different search parameters. Conferences can be a great source of information, both attending conferences and meeting people and engaging that way, but also conferences often will have their programs. You can search that in terms of talks that are given, and sometimes the proceedings will be available. Finally, and I've got this last, good old-fashioned Google searches is an option. It's possibly your less efficient option. It might be something that'll get you a lot of stuff you have to wade through, but it's certainly there as a possibility. So I'm going to pause for a minute, and I'm going to ask you to get your pen and paper. This is where I put you to work and have you write some things down. And I'd like you to write down 2 things. First, how would you like to use published research to inform your own work? And you can identify 1 thing, up to 3 things if you're a fast writer. But here's some examples. Identify best practices in online career counseling. Keep on top of new knowledge. Create an evidence base for my grant application. Whatever it might be, write down some ideas. And then if you could just identify actions that you might take to move this forward, and just simple first next steps. So I've got some examples there. Search the word online in Career Journal, Canadian Journal of Career Development. Sign up for new issue alerts from journals. So journals, actually, you can sign up just for alerts, and every time a new issue comes out, it'll send you an alert, and then you can look at the table of contents and see what's going on in your field. Locate 10 journal articles to start a literature review. So I'm just going to pause for about 30 more seconds and let you write those down. If you're willing, please feel free to add your responses into the question box. Oh, sorry. I'll give people just a minute more here. All right, I'm going to move us along. And like I said, if you want to add some responses in there, please do. And you have the handouts here, so if this wasn't enough time for you, please go back later and be sure to fill this this particular action item out. Second thing I want to focus on is the fact that I mentioned before that that people use evidence, research as a way of getting evidence, and we use this to inform decision making. We use this to inform practice, and research reports, even though that you might not see them as such, they're really an argument. They're making a case, and the case they're making is that their research is credible. Their evidence is credible, and that the evidence supports the conclusions of the arguments of their conclusion. Pardon me. So they're making sort of two arguments. Hey, I've done this research, and it's good research. It's credible. You should pay attention to this. And I'm making these conclusions based on this evidence, and these are good conclusions. So those are the arguments that they're putting forward. As a reader, it's your responsibility to say, okay, here's the arguments that they're making. Do I accept these arguments? Do I feel that these arguments are credible, acceptable arguments? Are they arguments that hold for me? And as we think through research reports, you're going to see a number of different elements in them. They might not have these exact titles, but you're going to see these parts. The first is the abstract. Depending on the research report, that might be referred to as an executive summary, but it's sort of a real distilled version of the core of what the research is. If it's an abstract, sometimes those are limited to like 100 words or up to 250 words. If it's like an executive summary, it might be more like 2 pages. But these are really sort of condensed forms. The introduction is going to sort of introduce the topic, obviously, but usually it will specify what the argument is that is going to be presented. It might have a thesis statement. It might say, well, these are the research questions, and here's the answers we're going to show. But they're typically they'll sort of state up front, this is what I'm going to be proving or demonstrating or arguing in my paper. Then it'll move to a literature review. Depending on the paper, it might be longer or shorter, but it's situating the research within a larger context. This is what we knew before. These are what the theories are about this. This is sort of how this research question can be understood. Then they'll outline the research design, how the data were collected. So the research design is going to say how the data were collected. Depending again on the study, this might be longer or shorter, but ideally in my mind, it'll sort of say what the strengths and the limitations of that research design were. Then it'll present the research findings. These will be the data presentations. Last week we talked about the difference between quantitative and qualitative data. If it's quantitative data, the data will typically be presented in graphs, in figures, in tables, things like that. If it's qualitative data, the data will be presented typically, sometimes in sort of summary tables with text in the table, in quotations of what people are saying, perhaps in images, but that's where we'll see that. Then it moves into a discussion and conclusion. So these might be separate sections, might be together, but it's sort of saying, well, what do we know from this study? What does this study tell us? And so if we think about the idea of the argument, we've got the argument at the front end in the introduction, sort of saying this is what I'm going to be arguing. We've got an argument in the research design saying, well, these are the data, and this is how it was collected, and this is why it's credible. And then we see an argument in the conclusion that's sort of saying, based on the research findings, this is what I or we as the research team believe this to mean. So as someone consuming research, what Jason Roy and I suggest, we have a research methods textbook, and what we suggest for anybody engaging with research to do in terms of reading research is not to start by just plowing in and saying, I'm going to read this article. That's highly inefficient. It's slower. And instead, we recommend using a two-pass approach. And so the first pass is a very quick pass, and it's what we refer to as the lay of the land. So you're going to take the article as a whole and want to get a sense of it, get a sense of the arguments, get a sense of the trustworthiness of the piece. So you're going to want to skim the abstract and the introduction, get a sense, what argument are they making here? What's the research question? What's the argument? Where are they going? You're going to skim the headings to get a sense of what the structure is, skim the methods to clarify, well, what's the methodology, skim the findings and the conclusion to see how they link back to the argument. And once you've got a sense, this lay of the land, you can think of it almost as you know how when you get into a vehicle and you're using your Google Maps, quite often, if you're like me, instead of just driving, you sort of take a zoom out and you're like, okay, what exactly is the path? That's what you're doing with this first pass, is you're saying, what's the lay of the land? What's the path here that we're going to be following? Then, assuming that after you've gotten the lay of the land, you've decided that you actually want to read the article, because you might get the lay of the land and be like, yeah, this isn't relevant to me. You just saved yourself a bunch of time, congratulations. But if you think it is relevant, then you do a deep dive. You sort of read the article and assess the argument, assess the trustworthiness, get a sense of, okay, what do I think? What do I think this is relevant? This approach, even though it's got two parts to it, will save you a lot of time. It'll make you a much more effective critical reader. The challenge with critical reading, and something I think that's really important to keep in mind, is that a lot of people get confused with critical reading, and they think critical reading means that you're just going to dump on everything. Oh, I'm going to be really critical. And critical reading, I think a better way to think of it is to think of it as discerning reading. So to quote Rubin, he writes that we need to think of critical reading as distinguishing between evidence. So he writes, our aim is not to learn how to find the perfect study. No such study exists. Every study has some limitations. Instead, we examine how to distinguish between evidence that, despite its relatively minor limitations, merits guiding our practice versus more seriously flawed evidence that should be viewed with more caution. So that's your goal as a critical reader, is to sort of figure out, well, what do I need to be cautious with, and what can I make use of? There's a challenge though, and the challenge is that we're human beings, and we have cognitive biases. I'm sure some of you have heard of or are familiar with the idea of cognitive biases. And these cognitive biases mean that when we go and approach research, when we go and approach information that's available to us, we're not going in with the open minds that we think that we have. There's a number of cognitive biases. I'll just mention 3 here that are important to keep in mind. One is motivated reasoning, and this is the tendency to deliberately interpret evidence to confirm a pre-existing belief. So let's say you believe that something about a career development practice is true, and you find some information out there that suggests it's true. Then you're likely to be like, yeah, this is great research, and I'm going to base all my work on this. This article's it. Here we go. Confirmation bias is seeking or interpreting evidence in ways that are partial to pre-existing expectations or a hypothesis in hand. So that's one type of motivated reasoning. Disconfirmation bias is the opposite. We have a tendency to be highly critical of information that contradicts our pre-existing beliefs. So to quote Edwards and Smith, Arguments incompatible with prior beliefs are scrutinized longer, subjected to more extensive refutational analyses, and consequently are judged to be weaker than arguments compatible with prior beliefs. All of this means that we approach the literature with biases that we need to be aware of. So we're humans. And even though you might be like, I'm not going to do that, you're human with a human brain. So that means that you are going to tend to attribute more expertise to those findings that are consistent with your own pre-existing beliefs, and that are less, you're going to attribute less expertise to those findings that are inconsistent with your own pre-existing beliefs. So be very aware of that. Be very conscious of that. As humans, we tend to cherry pick our use of information. Be conscious of that. You want to be sort of proactive and saying, you know, how can I make sure I'm more fulsome in how I approach things? And we also have a tendency to be very harsh on any work that doesn't confirm what we believe to be true. And so really watch for that in your own reading of work. There's a real challenge with critical reading and discerning reading and cognitive biases that people might end up going to what we can think of as research nihilism. And so what this is when you start thinking to yourself, oh, well, all research has some flaws. And because all research has some flaws, I don't need to use any evidence at all in my decision making. I'm going to dismiss all this evidence over here. And what it leads us back to is research, practice and decision making that is based on ideology, based on politics, based on the preference of individuals. And so, you know, if we become nihilistic in our approach to research, we end up in a position where we're not using evidence at all. So again, to quote Mullen and Striner, it is very easy to find flaws with all studies. It is much more difficult to teach people to differentiate between limitations and fatal flaws. That is, to judge whether the problems are serious enough to jeopardize the results of, or simply should be interpreted with a modicum of caution. Without this judgment, it is easy to become nihilistic, feeling that no study can be believed. And so with all of this, what I'm encouraging you to do is to read critically, but not to get to the point where you're like, well, I just have permission to dismiss everything outright. All of this together really points to the importance of research literacy, and this is something that I talked about in the CareerWise article that I referenced last week as well. And so I wrote, the challenge for CDPs is knowing how to engage with evidence responsibly and ethically. As a practitioner, you can quickly go online and find an abundance of information available of varying quality and trustworthiness. The risk to doing your own research is that, as a non-expert, you can be misled by poor quality studies and can easily misinterpret the results of good quality studies. So again, the onus is on you as someone using research to make sure that you have research literacy and to continuously build your research literacy, such as you're doing today, and this is a great start. There's a lot of resources out there, but you want to make sure that you are engaging in a very appropriate way. And again, this goes back to this the importance of understanding the evidence continuum. And as you think about the evidence continuum that we discussed last week, what you're wanting to do is you're wanting to say, okay, where is the body of evidence? Where are we along this larger evidence continuum? What this means is that as a consumer of research, you have to commit to considering both individual studies. Absolutely, you want to be looking at individual studies, but also looking at the larger body of knowledge. And so when you look at individual studies, you're going to look at the quality of those by themselves, and you're going to be thinking about that. But then when you look at evidence as a body of knowledge, you want to say, okay, how much is there out there? Is there just this one study? Is there just a few studies? Or is there a sort of a building body of information that I can build on? So if there's an argument that's out there and it doesn't have evidence, or it doesn't have quality evidence, you're going to be skeptical of that argument. If there's a small body of information, you'll be like, huh, that might be true. It might be. It's only when you start seeing a larger body of evidence coming in that you feel more and more confident with the information that's out there. So in terms of looking at individual studies, I think you want to be considering the strengths of the study and considering, well, how does this really help us understand? How does this help us describe and explain reality? And also think about the limitations of the study and how does this help? How is it limited in advancing our understanding? Typically, in academic research, we outline that information. We'll say, in our methods, these are the strengths of this approach, and these are the limitations of this approach. In our analysis and conclusion, we'll say, this is what the information tells us, and further research should consider this because our study doesn't answer these questions. So we'll often see that as something that's part of the discussion in an academic journal article. It may or may not be present in a non-academic source of research in that grey literature. Statistics Canada work, they have with any report that comes out with any study, there's something called the metadata, where there's reams of pages and pages of information saying this is the limitations of this and this is the limitations of that. Understanding the limitations is very important. I often find especially with for first and second year students that I'm teaching, when they're working with a study, they'll be like, oh, well, the study isn't as good because it says it has these limits. And my answer is no, that's actually a sign of trustworthiness. That's how you know that the researchers are aware of the limits of their own work. So I've got some questions here that you can take away that you can use when you review studies, and so you have these on the handouts. But you want to, as you go through individual studies, you can think through what's the argument. Do they have a balanced review of the literature and the literature review? Are they defining terms? Are they explaining the methodology? Is the analysis clear and balanced? Do you see how they connect the evidence and their argument? And overall, do you feel the argument is strongly, somewhat, or poorly supported by the evidence? When you're looking at bodies of literature, here's another checklist that you can take away and make use of. There's things called systemic reviews or review studies or literature reviews. These are special types of studies that are out there that publish synthesis of information. Those can be a wealth of knowledge for people working. They're often highly cited because they provide all this information together. You can look at the number of studies that are out there. Are there a handful, like less than 5? Are there like 20? And do they point to similar conclusions? Are they recent? If they're quite old, is there reason to be like, things have changed in that particular area? Did they occur in a country did they occur in Canada if you're working in Canada? Did they occur outside Canada? If they occurred elsewhere, are there contextual reasons to be wondering about the applicability of the study? And one tip that I have for you is to use a literature review spreadsheet. So you can sort of put these things in columns, put the articles on the side, and put that information in there. So a reflection point for you. I'm going to pause, and I realize we're running a little low on time here. So I'm just going to give you just a minute to write down, how can you start to make use, or if you're already making use, how can you start to make more use of published research in your work? And what's an easy first step? So if you could just write down your answer there. If you're willing, please put it into the question box. So what can you do? What could be a nice, easy way to get into this very, the easiest way to start engaging research in your own work? While you're reflecting on that, I'm going to leave this for now, but I'm just going to ask you, when you have a moment, perhaps later today, this is in the handouts for you to use, is to do a bit of a self-assessment. Consider the extent to which you're clear about how knowledge of evidence and research relates to your work as a career development practitioner, how you can locate research studies that are relevant to you, the difference between peer-reviewed and non-peer-reviewed studies, the core components of a research report, what the two-pass approach is, what cognitive biases are and why they matter, and how you can use different strategies to assess the trustworthiness of research. And hopefully you'll be able to make use of the checklists that I made available for you. And so lastly, I'm just going to, I apologize, we've only got a few minutes here, but if you want to connect with me, I've got here some ways to connect with me. If you have questions, please just put them into the question box. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and see if I can see if there's any questions that have come up. I see that people have put in different ways that they're planning to engage with research in the future. So that is wonderful to see. So, Cyril, is there any questions that you've seen that we could answer in a 1-minute question, perhaps?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you, Lolene, for your presentation. And just to say, it's so great to hear all and to read to all of your comment and reflection exercise and action that you guys will take, including some of them are subscribing to CERIC News and journal and article. I read also some comment of people, I'm going to take time now to read, research, etc. So great to see people,
wonderful.
New action after today's webinar. Yeah, we have a couple minutes or maybe a little more. Just to start with a quick question from Monique. What is white papers? Are they reliable?
So white papers typically, actually I shouldn't say, are often put out by governments to sort of float an idea, and so they may or may not be research based. So it can really depend. And so I would put, we're mixing colors here, but I'd put white papers into that gray literature zone where you want to sort of say, okay, what, be very discerning. Well, what's the source? Is it, if it's coming out of, for example, a government department, you would assume if they're putting it out there that they've got a certain evidence based. If they're being put out by a nonprofit or a politically based group or think tank, something like that, then you might want to be sort of saying, okay, are they using balance in their work? And so, yeah, that would be an area where you definitely want to be discerning. So I don't want to say that they're not reliable. They could be. But again, this is where it's a great question. It's where it depends, and where the importance of being a discerning reader is the onus lies on you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Lolene. Maybe another question from Nancy, who said that research is usually conducted for unique arguments, typically an hypothesis that hasn't been answered before. So therefore, how do we find similar studies for specific topics?
Excellent. Well, sometimes sometimes we need to say, okay, there might be exactly the topic we're looking at, but we might be able to sort of extend our search idea, might be able to find some adjacent ideas. So the way we often work in academia is that there's sort of a core sort of focus of an idea, and there might be very little on that, but then you can nudge it out a little bit. I'm going to try to think of an example that might make sense for career development practice. So perhaps there's an intervention of we try this particular workshop approach does it work or doesn't it? And there might be nothing specific on that, but there might be something on the efficacy of workshops generally. So sometimes we need to sort of continuing to sort of expand I'm not sort of showing my hands very well, sort of nudge out the circles as it goes, and sort of see how we can draw on information. The more far we get away from that core, the more we have to be tentative in saying it applies. But that can sort of be an expansion. I hope that makes sense. I'm sort of waving my hands around here.
Thank you so much, Lillian. Thank you. And yeah, unfortunately, it will be the last question for today. Thank you, everyone, for all the great question and comment we received one more time today. We'll make sure we forward them to Lillian. And Lillian, thank you so much for the second presentation today. I found it was super interesting to discuss the strategy that we can use to assess the trustworthiness of content and research, and how we can differentiate research. So thank you for sharing that with us today. And next week we'll continue our learning journey with our third and last webinar of the series, where we'll discuss how to conduct research in our career development practice. So I hope you will be with us next Wednesday, June 1st at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. And now, before closing the webinar, I just wanted to take the opportunity to remind you all about our content and learning survey that we will close tonight. It's actually a little piece of research that we are doing at CERIC to better understand your learning needs. So you can visit our website and just answer the survey. The survey closed tonight. Thank you in advance for your answer. But for now, let me close by wishing you all a great rest of your day, and see you all next week.
Bye, everyone. Take care.